So in our previous lecture, we had talked about the non-cooperation movement, ending with the withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement, the debate surrounding it, and the impact of the withdrawal. क्या देखा था हमने डिबेट में? कितने पर्सपेक्टिव्स हैं? दो पर्सपेक्टिव्स प्राइमरीली. कौन कौन से? The Marxist perspective and the nationalist perspective. Marxist perspective ने क्या argue किया है? That Gandhiji was not actually worried about violence. He simply used it as an excuse to withdraw the non-cooperation movement because he already was looking for an excuse to do so. क्यों? Because a radical movement had started against the zamindars and the industrialists were feeling the pinch of non-cooperation and boycott. They were making losses, right? That is why he used the Chori Chora incident as an excuse to withdraw the movement. Nationalists ने क्या बोला है? At firstly, violence which happened during the Chori Chora incident was against the Gandhian ideal of non-violent satyagraha, right? So morally he felt obligated to withdraw the movement. Secondly, he did not want to give an opportunity to the British to violently suppress the movement. Thirdly, he was worried about the cycle of violence which may start and which may take an unpredictable turn, right? Thus putting the movement completely out of the reach of the leaders. And lastly, it was part of his strategy of mass struggle, the STS PCP strategy. Okay? Now, we had also seen that the national movement also faltered as a result of the withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement. There was loss of consensus within the Congress as well as outside the Congress. Hindu-Muslim unity collapsed, and the decade of the 1920s witnessed great degree of communal violence, communal rioting. The British also experienced lesser pressure from the nationalists to bring in reforms, and thus the pace of constitutional reforms also slowed down. When they ultimately introduced the Simon Commission, they did so in a very arrogant manner. Okay? So this was the withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement. अब हमको देखना है उसका immediate aftermath. That is the Swarajist controversy. Okay? Now, once the non-cooperation movement was withdrawn, Mahatma Gandhi was arrested and sentenced to 6 years of rigorous imprisonment. Right. So the Congress was left virtually leaderless at this point of time. Okay. Now, the sudden withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement had also left many senior Congress leaders dissatisfied also. Okay. And some of them started to openly express doubts about the Gandhian strategy of satyagraha. So some openly expressed doubt about Gandhi's leadership as well as his satyagraha strategy, while others continued to follow him. Okay. Now, as a result, and ideological split within the Congress seemed imminent. ठीक है, तो जैसे मॉडरेट्स और एक्सट्रीमिस्ट के बीच में आइडियोलॉजिकल स्प्लिट इमर्ज हुआ था प्रिसीडिंग द सूरत स्प्लिट, वैसे ही कांग्रेस में अब एक आइडियोलॉजिकल स्प्लिट इमिनेंट था रिगार्डिंग द गांधीयन स्ट्रेटजी ऑफ सत्याग्रह एंड गांधीज लीडरशिप. Tensions rose in the context of the question of the post non-cooperation movement strategy that must be adopted by the Congress. ठीक है, now the Bardoli resolution had called for the continuation of the boycott of elections and legislative councils. ठीक है, so after the withdrawal of the movement, the Congress should continue to boycott elections as well as council entry, and instead focus its energy upon constructive work in the villages. That is, reinvigorating its grassroots network, working to improve the living conditions of people, especially in the villages, promoting Swadeshi enterprises and handicrafts, working towards anti-untouchability, working towards temperance, that is, anti-intoxication program, working towards anti-untouchability, Hindu-Muslim unity, etc. तो वो सब कंटिन्यू करेंगे. क्लियर है? Now, on these two questions, two groups ultimately emerged. Known as the pro-changers, also known as the Swarajists, and the no changers. Okay? The pro-changers consisted of leaders such as C.R. Das, Motilal Nehru, and Hakim Ajmal Khan. Okay? On the other hand, the no changers consisted of leaders such as C. Rajgopalachari, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, Dr. M.A. Ansari, and Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. Clear है इतना? Now, what did the pro-changers or Swarajists want? Did they want to continue the policy espoused by the Bardoli resolution or did they want to change it? नाम में ही है प्रो चेंजर्स हैं तो इसको चेंज करने की कोशिश करेंगे. They expressed doubts about the efficacy of कंस्ट्रक्टिव वर्क, कि इससे कोई फायदा नहीं होने वाला है. एंड दे वांटेड टू लिफ्ट द बॉयकॉट ऑन इलेक्शंस एंड काउंसिल एंट्री. ठीक है. On the other hand, the no changers, they wanted to continue boycotting elections and council entry since they were based on the illegitimate principle of diarchy. ठीक है. तो ये गांधी जी के कैंप में थे और ये सीआर दास के कैंप में थे. इतना क्लियर है? जस्टिफिकेशन समझ में आया है नो चेंजेस का? Why did they want to continue boycotting elections and council entry? Because it was based on diarchy, which as a principle was patently illegitimate, unfair, impractical. On the other hand, what was the justification given by the pro-changers to end the boycott? The pro-changers argued that A, if the Congress did not participate the government would be able to stuff councils with loyalists who are going to work against the best interests of Indians. So they did not want to give the government this opportunity. Secondly, B, इलेक्टोरल कैंपेनिंग एंड काउंसिल वर्क would enthuse the masses. Right? The Congress is going to be visibly present among the masses during the lengthy process of electoral campaigning, and entering the council, they would oppose the government at every turn and give hope to the masses for a better future, thus preserving the vote base and support base of the Congress. Clear? And C, they would mend or end the councils from within. ठीक है, तो अंदर घुस के या तो उसको सुधार देंगे या उसको खत्म कर देंगे. राइट? कैसे? Upon entering the council, they would bring popular resolutions and table popular bills, thus forcing the governor to use his extraordinary powers such as veto or certification or withholding assent. Thus, they would be able to expose the hypocrisy and hollowness of the Montfort reforms. They would either erode the trust of the people in it completely, thus making the Montfort reforms and the constitutional machinery established by it completely meaningless, or they would force the government to overcome the shortcomings of the Montfort reforms, thus mending them, thus reforming them. ठीक है, full stop लिखो. They would same. They would table popular motions, comma, forcing the governors to use their extraordinary powers of veto, certification and withholding assent, comma, withholding assent, ASSENT, comma, thus exposing withholding assent, thus exposing the hypocrisy and hollowness of the Montfort reforms, ठीक है. So this controversy had been going on within the Congress ever since the arrest of Mahatma Gandhi in March of 1922, and it continued to go on till the end of that year, when the two sides came face to face at the next Congress annual session. कहाँ पे हुआ ये सेशन? At गया. तो सब हेडिंग दो. December 1922, गया एनुअल सेशन. ठीक है. Now, once again, प्रो चेंजर्स और नो चेंजर्स में एक मतभेद इमर्ज हुआ. क्या? कि प्रेसिडेंट और सेक्रेटरी किस ग्रुप का होना चाहिए। ठीक है, लिखो। इन अ क्लोजली कंटेस्टेड इलेक्शन, कॉमा, CR Das एंड मोतीलाल नेहरू कौन से ग्रुप से थे? प्रो चेंजर्स और नो चेंजर्स? प्रो चेंजर्स, दैट इज स्वराजिस्ट, comma, were elected as president and secretary respectively. So this was a victory for the pro changers. And one of the first resolutions they introduced would be to lift the boycott of elections and council entry. ठीक है, they introduced a resolution to end the boycott of elections and council entry, thus allowing the Congress to participate in the upcoming elections. So elections had been scheduled for 1923, thus allowing the Congress to participate in the upcoming elections. ठीक है, क्या हुआ इस रेजोल्यूशन का? Was it accepted by the Congress or was it rejected? तो देखो यहाँ पे हुआ क्या, that after CR Das and Motilal Nehru won the election, they became extremely confident, right? And they very quickly introduced the resolution to end the boycott, little realizing that while Mahatma Gandhi was not in the scene, that he was behind bars, but he still continued to draw a lot of support from the rank and file of the Congress. तो ऑल इंडिया कांग्रेस कमेटी ने इनके इस रेजोल्यूशन को रिजेक्ट कर दिया। ठीक है, नेक्स्ट लिखो। इन अनदर क्लोज वोट, comma, this resolution was defeated. And how do you think that CR Das and Motilal Nehru felt about this? That this was their own moral defeat, and having been not able to win the confidence of the All India Congress Committee, they should not be its president or secretary. Therefore, they both resigned from their offices. ठीक है, feeling that this was a moral defeat, comma, CR Das and Motilal Nehru resigned from their office. And not only that, they prepared to resign from the Congress itself along with all their supporters. Once again, the vote had been very close, so it threatened to tear asunder the unity within the Congress permanently, like the Surat split. Next point likho. It appeared that they and their supporters would resign from the Congress to establish a separate political party. ठीक है? Next point. Such a split would have permanently weakened the Congress and the national movement as a whole. ठीक है? Thus, there was an urgent need to avoid it at all costs. And इसको कैसे avoid किया जा सकता है? By doing what the extremists and moderates had failed to do. That is, to reach a compromise. ठीक है? Next point लिखो. To avoid it, Mahatma Gandhi intervened and suggested a compromise. क्या compromise? That instead of leaving the Congress, the pro-changers should be allowed to contest in the upcoming elections as a subgroup within the Congress. ठीक है? That is, the pro-changers should be allowed to contest the upcoming elections as a subgroup within the Congress. ठीक है? The Congress also accepted and ratified this compromise, resulting in the formation of the Swaraj Party at the end of the Gaya session on the 1st of January 1923. Clear? So write down. The Congress accepted this compromise with the All India खिलाफत स्वराजिस्ट पार्टी, और इन शॉर्ट स्वराज पार्टी, being established in January 1923 with C.R. Das as president and Motilal Nehru as secretary. क्लियर है इतना? With C.R. Das as president and Motilal Nehru as secretary. Okay. Now, how did they perform in the upcoming elections? As expected, they performed quite well. After all, they were a subgroup of the Congress, and the Congress was undoubtedly the most popular party in the entire country. The Swarajists performed well especially in the Central Legislative Assembly, the UP Legislative Assembly, and Bengal Legislative Assembly. UP Legislative Assembly and Bengal Legislative Assembly. Right? In all three cases, they were able to secure a majority. Write down. They secured a majority in several legislatures. In several legislatures. Now, although they had majority and were invited to form the government, did they do it? Or did they choose to remain in opposition only? They chose to remain in opposition. Why? Because they did not want to cooperate with the principle of diarchy. Council entry से diarchy effect में नहीं आ जाएगा. Diarchy would come into effect when the legislators would enter the government, would accept office. ठीक है? Write down. However, they elected to remain in opposition instead of accepting office. When you say accepting office, it means ministerial office. Okay? Instead of accepting office. Next sub point. Along with other nationalist parties, comma, they exposed the hollowness of the diarchy arrangement. Of the diarchy arrangement as well as the hypocrisy of the government. ठीक है? Next sub point. Vittal Bhai Patel became the first Indian president of the Central Legislative Assembly. उस समय जो स्पीकर होता था उसको प्रेसिडेंट बोला जाता था. So he was the presiding officer, right? Became the first Indian president of the Central Legislative Assembly. Full stop. Next sub point. The Swarajists tabled several bills that had to be vetoed, comma, passed cuts that had to be restored, and defeated motions that had to be certified by the governors. Stop. Next sub point. They also passed adjournment motions against the government to criticize it and raised several questions of public importance. Raised several questions of public importance. ठीक है? So, were they actually doing what they had promised? वो काम कर रहे थे या नहीं कर रहे थे? Were they trying to end or mend the councils from within or not? Yes, they were doing that. Thus, the Swarajists fulfilled their promise of mending or ending the councils from within. ठीक है? Further, they also offered a new alternative to the path towards non-cooperation. Now, one way was the Gandhian strategy, that is to boycott the elections and councils altogether. But do you think that what the Swarajists were doing was a form of cooperation with the government? No, they were simply participating in the constitution machinery in order to expose its hollowness. Next point, likho. Further, the Swarajists were able to offer an innovative alternative towards non-cooperation, other than boycott, other than boycott. And as a result, was the national struggle left poorer or was it enriched? It was enriched. New energy, new ideas, new leaders, new methods of non-cooperation. Write down. As a result, they enriched the national movement by introducing a new strategy and new methods. Okay. Now, this strategy would also be adopted by the Congress in the future. After the withdrawal of the civil disobedience movement also, a strategic debate is going to emerge within the Congress. Once again, यहाँ पे जैसे दो साइड से वहां पे तीन साइड्स होंगे कि एक गांधीयन साइड हो गया, एक सोशलिस्ट साइड हो गया, एक कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल साइड हो गया. Once again, the questions remained the same. Should we boycott the elections or should we enter the councils? If we do choose to enter the councils, should we remain in opposition or should we form the government, right? So the Swarajist controversy acted as a guiding light for the future generation of congressmen and nationalists. Next point, likho. The Swarajist strategy was the Swarajist strategy acted as a guide for the future nationalists. Full stop. Sub point. A strategic debate emerged within the Congress following the civil disobedience movement on the question of council entry. Full stop. The positive experience of the Swaraj Party allowed the Congress to choose the option of entering councils ठीक है. Further, it was the political opposition of the Swarajists that to a great degree convinced the British that the principle of diarchy is not going to work in the Indian conditions, right? That Indian politicians are too mature to indulge in it and they are not going to cooperate. Thus, they were forced to reform it in the upcoming round of reforms. So, diarchy was abolished in the provinces in the Government of India Act 1935 and complete provincial autonomy was introduced. Write down. The pressure created by the Swarajists convinced the British that provincial diarchy was unworkable in India. This was partly the reason why they abolished it through the Government of India Act 1935. To the Government of India Act 1935. क्लियर है इतना? नेक्स्ट पॉइंट लिखो. फर्दर the Congress was able to avoid another Surat-like split which would have definitely derailed the national struggle. Which would definitely have derailed the national struggle. Instead, what happened? The formation of the Swaraj Party and its stellar performance in the elections and in the legislative councils actually helped to conserve the momentum that had been built by the national struggle so far. Instead, the Swaraj Party's actions helped conserve the momentum of the struggle. ठीक है, तो ये तो सारे हमने देख लिए हैं पॉजिटिव आउटकम्स क्या हुए हैं स्वराजिस्ट कंट्रोवर्सी के. क्या क्या देखा हमने? दैट firstly, the Swarajists performed well in the elections, thus proving the popularity of the Congress at the ground level, but they elected to remain in opposition instead of accepting office, and along with other nationalist parties, they worked to expose the hollowness of diarchy. First time an Indian was elected as president of the Central Legislative Assembly. Further, the Swarajists brought several bills that had to be vetoed by the governor, passed several cuts to the budget that had to be restored by the governors, and defeated several motions that had to be certified by the governors. They also passed adjournment motions and raised several questions of public importance. Thus, the Swarajists fulfilled their promise of trying to mend or end the councils from within. Further, the Swarajists were able to offer an innovative alternative towards non-cooperation other than boycott. As a result, they enriched the national movement by introducing a new strategy and new methods. Moreover, the Swarajists also acted as a guide to future nationalists because they had already proven that council entry did not mean cooperation. They provided a new path to future nationalists in the post-civil disobedience movement period. Further, they were able to exert sufficient pressure that the government was forced to reconsider its position on diarchy in the provinces, ultimately removing it through the 1935 Government of India Act. And the the Congress was able to avoid another Surat-like split, which would have derailed the movement. On the other hand, conversely, the Swaraj Party's actions helped to actually conserve the momentum of the national struggle. ठीक है, तो ये तो पॉजिटिव आउटकम्स हुए. नेक्स्ट पॉइंट लिखो. However, following the death of C.R. Das in 1925, the Swarajist movement began losing direction. Okay? So he was a master organizer, and after him, the movement started becoming directionless. Alright? ऐसे में हुआ क्या? Many Swarajist leaders began accepting government office. ठीक है? So they began to accept the governmental ministerial positions. Full stop. Next point. In other words, they began cooperating with the British or with the government within the framework of diarchy. Now, was this in line with the original message of the Swarajists, or was it completely against that? Completely against that. The Swarajists wanted only to end or mend the councils from within, not to cooperate with the government, and definitely not to legitimize the principle of diarchy. Next up point. Thus, they legitimized this unfair movement or this unfair principle and what is going to be the result? Will they continue to have the support of the people or will they lose it? They will lose it. And thus, and therefore, lost popular support. In a letter to Jawaharlal Nehru, Motilal Nehru had in fact lamented this fact that the Swarajist leaders are not being able to overcome the allure, the pull of government office, of ministerial position, and they are sacrificing their principles to enjoy the fruits of governmental power, right? And this was a very alarming development for Motilal Nehru, right? And therefore they lost popular support. By 1927, 1928, the movement had lost its original sheen, right? By 1927, the movement had lost its original sheen. ठीक है? And in this scenario, जो मेन स्ट्रीम नेशनल मूवमेंट था, कांग्रेस का मूवमेंट था, उसके अगेंस्ट कोई ऑल्टरनेटिव अब बचा नहीं था, राइट? एंड फाइनली एन इवेंट वुड टेक प्लेस which would force the Swarajists to give up their independent way of working and join the mainstream Congress movement. What was that? The appointment of the Simon Commission. ठीक है? Full stop. The appointment of the Simon Commission prompted mass resignations of the Swarajists who joined the mainstream Congress movement once again. Who joined the mainstream Congress movement once again. क्लियर है? तो ये हो गया दी स्वराजिस्ट कंट्रोवर्सी. टेक डाउन अ क्वेश्चन. Discuss the features of the Swarajist movement which emerged within the national struggle following the withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement. Full stop. Highlight its significance to the national movement. 200 words, 15 marks. Consider it for a couple of minutes while I come back. Have you been able to make any headway regarding this? क्या demand है यहाँ का? We have to highlight the features of the Swarajist movement and its significance. Significance तो आप इसको highlight कर लोगे आसानी से. हमने काफी लंबे चौड़े वे में डिस्कस किया है इसको, right from here onwards. Now, how about the features of the Swarajist movement? तो इसको अप्रोच कैसे करेंगे आंसर को? First, we'll have to provide a brief background, जो कि यहाँ पे ऑलरेडी आपको हिंट मिला हुआ है. Following the withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement, क्या बोलोगे? An ideological split seemed imminent regarding important questions about the strategy to be adopted after the withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement. Two groups emerged, Swarajists and No Changers, and Swarajists wanted to end the policy of boycotting elections and council entry. Right? Features क्या थे इस मूवमेंट के? It represented an ideological and strategic diversion from the mainstream movement. Secondly, while it was not anti-Gandhian, it was contrary to Gandhian strategy and philosophy. ठीक है. Thirdly, it represented a merger of radical and constitutional struggle. While struggle was to continue, it was to be done with constitutional means, that is within the councils, but for radical aims and for a with radical methods. It would involve continuous opposition of the government in order to attain what was the objective? स्वराज, नाम में ही है, right? और बताओ क्या फीचर्स आप हाईलाइट कर सकते हो इस मूवमेंट के? दैट देखो, द मूवमेंट बिगैन फॉल्टरिंग आफ्टर द डेथ ऑफ सीआर दास। इसका मतलब क्या हुआ? तो that it was a movement that depended upon a few personalities rather than a concrete ideology. ठीक है? So it was a personality led movement rather than an ideological movement. Fifthly, it resulted in the emergence of a schism within the Congress. Without actually resulting in a permanent rupture. Was the movement democratic or autocratic? It was democratic. Did it enjoy popular support or not? It did. Was it able to defend the interests of Indians or did it sacrifice the core interests of Indians? It was able to defend the core interests of the Indians, at least in the beginning. It is only after the death of C.R. Das that it lost its way. So it was a nationalist, anti-colonial movement that was working towards the attainment of Swaraj. ठीक है? So these are the features of the Swarajist movement. क्या क्या? It was an ideological and strategic diversion from the mainstream movement. It was a contrary or alternative to the Gandhian strategy and philosophy. It represented a merger of radical and constitutional methods of struggle. It was a personality-led movement rather than an ideological movement. It resulted in the emergence of a schism within the Congress without a permanent rupture. It was a democratic movement since its very beginning. The process of the creation of the Swaraj Party and the methods that it utilized. It was a popular movement as reflected in the overwhelming support to the Swarajist Party during the elections. And it was definitely a nationalist and anti-colonial movement right from the very beginning. It was meant to oppose the colonial regime and the principle of diarchy while furthering the interests of India as a nation. ठीक है? तो ये हो गए इसके features, right? And with this we have covered the Swarajist Party. Next major development in the national struggle was the Simon Commission and anti-Simon agitation. ठीक है, अब ये साइमन कमीशन था क्या? It was a commission that was established by the British government to review the working of the Government of India Act 1919. ठीक है, officially it was known as the Indian Statutory Commission. Consisting of 7 members. With Sir John Simon as president and the future British Prime Minister Clement Attlee as co-president. It was set up in accordance with the principles of the Montfort reforms themselves. The Government of India Act 1919 provided for the creation of such an Indian Statutory Commission to review the working of this act after a passage of 10 years. That means 10 years of operation के बाद. ठीक है? However, instead of waiting for a full period of 10 years, the British government decided to set this up early. In November 1927, the Government of India Act 1919 had entered into force on the 23rd of December 1919. तो कम से कम दिसंबर 1919 तक रुकना चाहिए था, लेकिन 2 साल पहले ही सेटअप कर दिया. And why was this? Because general elections were going to happen in Britain in 1928. और जो रूलिंग पार्टी थी, दैट इज द कंजर्वेटिव पार्टी, उनका गवर्नमेंट था. Conservative government was expected to lose. Right? And thus, the task of setting up the Indian Statutory Commission would have fallen to the next government, which would likely have been a liberal government. Now, the conservatives had traditionally been harder towards Indians, right? So they were more of the imperialist nature, more controlling. Liberals, on the other hand, had traditionally displayed a softer attitude towards India. And the conservatives did not want to leave the task of setting up such an important commission which could decide the political future of India as a whole to irresponsible liberal hands. Okay? So that is why they jumped the gun and set up this commission 2 years in advance. This commission had a twofold mandate. Firstly, it was expected to review the functioning of diarchy, and on the basis of its analysis, it was expected to report whether to extend, restrict, or modify the scope of responsible government in India. ठीक है? Now, had the 1919 Act introduced any element of responsible government? Yes, partially responsible government in the provinces had been introduced. So it was expected to suggest whether the principle of responsible government should be extended further, that means more responsible government should be introduced, whether whatever has been given that should be taken back or restricted in any other way, or whether it should be modified in any way. ठीक है? तो एक तो इसका टास्क ये था, and second, to report whether the relationship between British India and the princely states needs to be modified. ठीक है? So since 1857, the British had been following a policy of friendly neutrality towards the princely states, friendly cooperation towards the princely states, right? Now, this commission was supposed to report back to the British Parliament whether this policy needs to be changed and if a more closer association with the princely states was possible or not, leading towards an all India federation consisting of both the British Indian provinces as well as the princely states. तो इस चीज के ऊपर रिपोर्ट करना था. However, as soon as the news of the appointment of this commission reached India, there was a huge uproar among all Indian political parties. सबने इसको by and large boycott कर दिया except for a few, and massive protests erupted across India. When this commission actually arrived at Bombay in early 1928, तो जहाज से आ रहे थे गेटवे ऑफ इंडिया से इन्होंने डिसएम्बार्क किया. They were met with huge crowds waving black flags and chanting Simon go back. ये ट्रेन से गाड़ी से जहां जहां पे जाते थे once again same इनके demonstrations मिलते थे, agitations मिलते थे कई सारे Simon go back वाले black flag agitations. Public burning of British cloth was done. Now, why do you think all of this was happening? Because it had been set up 2 years in advance? No. What was the reason for the opposition of Indians? It was the composition of this commission, right? कितने total members थे? 7 members. How many of them were Indians? 0. कोई भी नहीं था. ठीक है? It was an all-white commission, and it was this that angered the Indian nationalists. That this was a very important commission that would decide the constitutional future of India, right? And Indians had not been considered fit to have even a single representative within it. पूरे देश में इनको एक भी बंदा ऐसा नहीं मिला जो कि इंडियंस को रिप्रेजेंट कर सकता था. ऐसा हो नहीं सकता. So this smacked of absolute racism, and that is why Indian political parties, Indian nationalists of almost all political hues boycotted this commission. ठीक है? नहीं मिले except for a few. कौन कौन मिला इनसे? डॉक्टर अंबेडकर मिले, लिबरल्स मिले, द यूनियनिस्ट पार्टी मेट देम एंड द जस्टिस पार्टी मेट देम. ठीक है? डॉक्टर अंबेडकर ने क्या डिमांड किया? सेपरेट इलेक्टोरेट्स फॉर दलित्स. यूनियनिस्ट ने क्या डिमांड किया? ग्रेटर प्रोटेक्शंस फॉर द फार्मर्स ऑफ पंजाब. लिबरल्स ने क्या डिमांड किया? मोर कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल लिबरल रिफॉर्म्स. मॉडरेट्स जो उनके डिमांड से रहते थे पहले से. एंड जस्टिस पार्टी ने क्या डिमांड किया? reservation in matters of public employment and education for the non-Brahmins of Tamil Nadu, for the non-Brahmins of the Madras Presidency. These were the things that were demanded. Other than them, everybody else boycotted the Simon Commission. Clear है? तो लिख लीजिए जल्दी से. Simon Commission and the anti-Simon agitation. Write down. The conservative government of Britain set up the Indian Statutory Commission, within brackets, Simon Commission, in November 1927. November 1927, to review the working of the Montfort reforms. To review the working of the Montfort reforms. Full stop. Next point. The Montfort reforms had provided for the appointment of such a commission, after 10 years of its operation. After 10 years of its operation. Full stop. After 10 years of its operation. Full stop. However, the conservatives who were expected to lose the upcoming general elections in 1928, did not want to leave the task of setting up such an important commission in, within quotes, right, irresponsible liberal hands. In irresponsible liberal hands. Did not want to leave the task of setting up such an important commission in irresponsible liberal hands. ठीक है? Next point लिखो. Next main point. The commission had the following mandate. A and B. A, to determine whether the scope of responsible government in India needed to be extended, restricted, or modified. Extended, restricted, or modified. B. To determine whether the relationship between British India and the princely states, whether the relationship between British India and the princely states needs to be altered. Needs to be altered. Full stop. Next point. Next main point. As soon as the news of the appointment of this commission reached India, of this commission reached India, comma, there was a huge outcry. There was a huge outcry. Full stop. It was an all-white commission. It was an all-white commission. And not a single Indian, had been considered capable enough, and not a single Indian had been considered capable enough to determine India's political future. India's political future. Full stop. Next point. Since its arrival in India, in early 1928, comma, the commission was met with black flag agitations, comma, bonfires of British cloth, comma, massive demonstrations and chants of Simon go back. Full stop. Next point. Almost all political parties, including the Congress, Swaraj Party, Hindu Mahasabha, and Muslim League boycotted it, comma, exhibiting remarkable political unity. remarkable political unity. Full stop. Next point. The anti-Simon agitation. The anti-Simon agitation also spread to the princely states. To the princely states. With the emergence of the Praja Mandal movement. Within brackets you can write States People's Movement. States People's Movements. Okay? Now, this was a symptom of the growing wave of nationalism among the masses of the princely states. They wanted democratic reforms, unification with India, and liberation from British rule as well. Okay? So, they did not want to continue being governed by their respective princes. And the Congress, especially the younger generation of Congress, led by Jawaharlal Nehru, had taken the lead in encouraging such movements in growing. The Simon Commission presented a golden opportunity to push the banner of nationalism in the princely states, because it called for the altering of the relationship between British India and princely states. And that is why this issue had become very relevant, and the rights of the people living in the princely states and their nationalist urges, their right to attain democracy, right for constitutional reforms, right for responsible government, all these questions were raised also, right? As a result, it was during the it was in the backdrop of the Simon Commission agitation that nationalism became quite popular in the princely states also. Clear है इतना? Next point लिखो. अभी क्या लिखा आपने? What is the exact line? प्रजा मंडल movement और states people movement. Full stop. Same point में ही continue करो. The Congress, especially Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, played a leading role in spreading nationalist consciousness among the masses of the princely states. Among the masses, nationalist consciousness among the masses of the princely states. Full stop. Next point, main point. However, some leaders and parties did not boycott the Simon Commission. And raised significant demands. ABCD करके लिखो. Dr. Ambedkar demanded separate electorates for the Dalits or for the depressed classes, for the depressed classes, for the depressed classes. B, the Justice Party demanded reservations for non-Brahmins of the Madras constituency in government services, comma, education and legislative representation. C, the Unionist Party of Punjab demanded greater protections for landowners and peasants D, some Muslim leaders demanded the creation of a Muslim majority province by separating the Sindhi speaking areas of the Bombay Presidency. ठीक है? So some of them actually cooperated with the Simon Commission. Next main point लिखो. However, nevertheless, comma, the anti-Simon agitation revived the era of mass anti-colonial protests. Full stop. Mass anti-colonial protests. Full stop. The British felt deeply embarrassed by the popularity of the Simon agitation, of the anti-Simon agitation. And what is going to be the result? They would try and brutally suppress the agitation. Thus, comma, they began brutally suppressing it. using lathi charge, mass arrests, and preventive detention. And preventive detention. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट. हाँ, लाला लाजपत राय, लाला लाजपत राय was grievously injured in a police lathi charge while leading a public demonstration. In a police lathi charge while leading a public demonstration at Lahore. While leading a public demonstration at Lahore. And passed away a few days later. And passed away a few days later. ठीक है, next sub point. The mood of the masses, became radical. The mood of the masses became radical. And the Simon Commission was forced to retire. ठीक है, ये अब जान का खतरा बन सकता है. तो they were forced to suspend their activities, their tour of India to meet different personalities, different parties, different rulers, etc. Next sub point लिखो. In 1929, Bhagat Singh and his comrades avenged Lala Lajpat Rai by assassinating J.P. Saunders. Who they mistakenly believed was responsible for Lala Lajpat Rai's death. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट लिखो. In the meanwhile, the government became increasingly frustrated. And began searching for a way out. To destroy national unity. ठीक है. One thing the British could never tolerate, could never palate, was a common action by Indians of different political parties, different religions, because that is when the British were weakest, and thus they desperately needed a way to dissolve this national unity. It is in this context that the British Secretary of State for India, his name was Lord Birkenhead. issued a challenge to all Indians. Kya? That since Indians are not ready to cooperate with the Simon Commission, whose recommendations would become the basis for the draft of new constitutional reforms, why don't the Indians themselves draft a set of constitutional reforms? And if there is a consensus of all the important political parties regarding this set of reforms, the British are going to implement it without any delay, right? And this challenge became the basis for the Indian political parties coming together, holding different all-party conferences and appointing the Nehru Committee. In May 1928, which finally submitted its report, the Nehru Report, in September 1928, which was then forwarded to the different political parties for consideration. ठीक है? So next heading दे दो, the Nehru Committee Report. Nehru Committee Report. लिखो. The Secretary of State for India, Lord Birkenhead, becoming increasingly frustrated by the boycott of the Simon Commission, challenged Indians to prepare their own draft of constitutional reforms. Full stop. If a consensus of all political parties emerged, the British would implement it without any delay. Full stop. Next point. In response, the Indian parties held three all-party conferences at Delhi, Bombay, and Lucknow. After which a committee chaired by Motilal Nehru was appointed to prepare this draft to prepare this draft. Full stop. Subpoint. The Nehru Committee consisted of several jurists and leaders, jurists and leaders such as Subhash Chandra Bose, Ali Imam, M.R. Jayakar, and Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru. And Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru. Full stop. So, Subhash Chandra Bose represented the left within the Congress. He represented the youth within the Congress. Ali Imam represented the Muslim League. M.R. Jayakar represented the Hindu Mahasabha. And Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru represented the moderates, the liberals. Okay? So, the Nehru Committee consisted of a cross section of all Indian political parties or the entire Indian political spectrum. Next point likho. Next main point. In September 1928, the Nehru Committee submitted its draft in the form of a report with the following recommendations and demands. क्या क्या थे नेहरू रिपोर्ट के प्रोविजंस? Following recommendations and demands. 1, 2, 3, 4 करके लिखो. Number 1. Dominion status within the British Empire. Number 2. Secularism. That is, India would not have any state religion. And its people would not have any state religion, and its people would enjoy the freedom of religion. Number 3. Universal adult franchise. That is universal adult franchise. That is, everyone above the age of 21 years would have the right to vote, irrespective of their socio-economic status. irrespective of their socio-economic status. Number 4, abolition of separate electorates. Abolition of separate electorates. Number 5, reservation for Muslims wherever they were in minority. ठीक है? So not in proportion to their population, irrespective of whether they were in majority or in minority in a province. Rather, reservation only in those provinces where Muslims were in minority. ठीक है? Number 6, fundamental rights for all Indians, including the right to equality for both men and women. For both men and women. Including the right to equality for both men and women. Number 7, federal polity. Federal polity with a strong center. Federal polity with a strong center. ठीक है? So these were the core provisions of the Nehru report. Now, once it was prepared, it was forwarded to the different political parties for consideration. And now we need to take a look at the response. Response of different political parties. Response of different political parties. Number 1, the Congress. Did it accept or reject the Nehru report? It accepted all the provisions of the Nehru report. Write down. Congress accepted all the recommendations of the Nehru report. Huh? All the recommendations of the Nehru report. Second, young leaders within the Congress. We are talking about leaders such as Subhash Chandra Bose and Jawaharlal Nehru. Did they accept or reject the report? They also accepted, but only partially. There was only one provision that they were opposed to. And क्या provision था? The demand for dominion status. They wanted complete independence. पूर्ण स्वराज चाहिए. Write down. Young leaders within the Congress accepted the report partially. Full stop. Instead of dominion status, they wanted complete independence. Complete independence. Number 3, Hindu Mahasabha. Accepted or rejected the Nehru report? Rejected it. On the grounds that it provided reservations for Muslims. Reservations for Muslims. And lastly, the Muslim League. Muslim League. Did it accept or reject the Nehru report? Rejected. With Jinnah arguing, rejected with Jinnah arguing that it did not have sufficient protection for Muslim interests. For Muslim interests. Protection for Muslim interests. And in response, raised his famous 14-point demand program. 14-point demand program. Next heading though, Jinnah's "14-point demands." Write down. In response to the Nehru report, Jinnah raised 14 demands in the interest of Indian Muslims. Full stop. Of these, comma, there were 5 key demands. There were 5 key demands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 करके लिखो. Number 1, separate electorates. Should continue till universal adult franchise is introduced. Till universal adult franchise is introduced. Number 2, reservation for Muslims in proportion to their population. Number 3, 1/3 seats in the Central Legislative Assembly to be reserved for Muslims. Number 4, minority veto. And number 5, federal polity with a weak center. ठीक है? Now, he argued that till universal adult franchise is introduced, separate electorates should continue. Why? Because Muslims were socially and educationally backward as compared to Hindus. And in the framework of limited franchise, Hindus are always going to have an upper hand. Therefore, Hindus are going to be overrepresented. Very few Muslims would have the right to vote, and thus, according to him, separate electorates was a necessity. He argued that reservation should be given to Muslims not simply where they are in minority, but in proportion to their population. Once again, the argument was the same, that Indian Muslims are socially and educationally backward, and reservation is equally important in Muslim majority provinces, because given that Hindus are socially and educationally forward, are socially and educationally better off, they would once again be overrepresented, and thus even in Muslim majority provinces, Muslim interests are going to be undermined. He said that since Muslims constitute 1/3 of the total population of India, at least 1/3 seats in the Central Legislative Assembly should be reserved for Muslims, and this is only fair according to him. He insisted upon minority veto. Since India is a Hindu majority country, therefore bills may be introduced which harm the interests of the Muslim community, and if the Muslim community does not want such bills or provisions to be passed, then it should have the right to veto it in order to protect its religion, culture, and sensitivities. And finally, he wanted a federal polity with a weak center, so that the Muslim majority provinces would be able to carve out their own destiny and would not be beholden to a strong center which would always be dominated by the Hindu majority. Overall, India में Hindu majority है. Is this clear? Now, in 1916, what was the Congress's position regarding these issues? Was the Congress in favor of separate electorates? लखनऊ पैक्ट में एक्सेप्ट किया था कि नहीं? करा था. Did it accept the idea of reservation for Muslims in proportion to their population? Also yes. Did it accept the idea of reserving 1/3 seats for Muslims in the central legislature? Yes, this was one of the verbatim provisions. Did it accept the principle of minority veto? Yes, that if the majority of the minority members of a legislature oppose a bill, then the Congress as a whole would oppose it also. It would not allow it to pass. Did the Congress accept the framework of a federal polity with a weak center in 1916? No. The Congress throughout was searching for greater unity politically, right? However, in 1928, the picture was very different. Congress was now opposed to all these demands. Okay? So by 1928, हमने देखा ना, बिकॉज ऑफ द राइज ऑफ पॉपुलिस्ट पॉलिटिक्स एंड द ब्रेकडाउन ऑफ कम्युनल यूनिटी, द इमर्जेंस ऑफ कम्युनल वायलेंस थ्रू आउट द एंटायर डेकेड ऑफ द 1920s, and because of the changes made by the constitution amendment in 1920, जो कांग्रेस ने नया कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन अडॉप्ट किया था, the Congress and the Muslim League lost the ability to enter into a compromise, and thus no compromise could emerge, right? So this represented the first visible breach between the Congress and the Muslim League. Write down. Next point. However, all these demands were rejected by the Congress, and no compromise could be reached. This represented the first major breach between the Congress and Muslim League. ठीक है? Full stop. Next point. While many of these demands had been acceptable to the Congress, under the Lucknow Pact, within brackets 1916, comma, the growth of populism and right-wing ideology among the Congress workers prevented any compromise. This we have already addressed in our last lecture. ठीक है, डिटेल में हमने डिस्कस कर लिया इसको. So this was the Nehru report and Jinnah's 14-point demand program. Is this clear? Now, following this, what would happen is that the Congress is going to endorse the Nehru report in its annual session in 1928 at Calcutta, and साथ में it is going to give a 1-year ultimatum, 1-year deadline to the government, that the government has 1 year to implement the provisions of the Nehru report. Otherwise, in the next annual session, we are going to let go of our demand of dominion status and raise the demand of Poon Swaraj, and we are going to launch a major movement in order to attain it. Okay? And that is what happened actually. The Governor General kept ignoring the Congress's ultimatum. The younger nationalists kept building pressure and started to mobilize support within the Congress in favor of the demand of Poon Swaraj. And finally, 1928 came, Poon Swaraj resolution was adopted, and the high command was transferred to Mahatma Gandhi in order to launch a program of civil disobedience in order to attain complete independence. Okay? So that is what happened. Now, these things we are going to discuss in tomorrow's lecture. आज जो हमने डिस्कस किया है इतना सब क्लियर है? The entire picture is clear. Chronology समझ में आया है ना कि कैसे कैसे डेवलपमेंट्स हो रहे हैं, प्रोविजंस क्लियर हैं सारे. ठीक है. If there are no doubts, shall I end this lesson? All right then. Thank you for your time. कल मिलते हैं, पूर्ण स्वराज रेजोल्यूशन सिविल डिसोबीडियंस अप टू 1937 कंप्लीट करने की कोशिश करेंगे।